The town of Harmony Gulch had a favorite pastime, and it was watching Adeline. From the porch of the general store, men would lean back on their chairs, whittling away the afternoon and their judgment upon the young widow. They called her Project Adeline's Folly, a name that started as a whisper in the saloon and grew into a common joke traded over sacks of flour and barrels of nails. Across the deep, jagged ravine that separated her small cabin from the limestone cliffs, she was building a bridge. But it was no ordinary bridge. It was a long, covered tunnel of raw timber, a wooden serpent inching its way over the chasm, connecting the safety of her home to the dark mouth of a cave. Every day, for nearly 2 years, she worked. The rhythmic thud of her hammer echoed through the valley, a lonely heartbeat in the vast quiet of the frontier. She was a slight figure against the immense landscape, her movements economical and precise, her German shepherd, Kaiser, a constant shadow at her side. To the town, it was a spectacle of grief turned to madness. "She's building a walkway to nowhere," Mr. Gable, the store owner, would say with a chuckle, adjusting his spectacles. "Poor girl. Losing a husband so young must have rattled something loose." Finn, the blacksmith whose arms were as thick as tree limbs, would grunt in agreement. "It's unnatural. A woman her age ought to be looking for a new husband, not holing up in the woods talking to rocks." They saw a fragile mind broken by loss, a 21-year-old widow now 23, wasting her youth on a monument to her own eccentricity. They saw splintered wood and misplaced hope. They saw a fool. What they didn't see, what they couldn't comprehend, was the cold, clear logic behind every single plank she laid. They didn't understand that Adeline wasn't building a bridge to escape her loneliness, she was building an ark to escape the memory of a day when the world had simply washed away, taking everything she loved with it. And as the autumn air began to carry a new, sharper bite, the thud of her hammer seemed to grow more urgent, a sound that the town heard as madness, but was, in fact, a prayer against the coming ice. Adeline's life was a study in quiet discipline. Dawn found her not in bed, but outside, her breath pluming in the crisp mountain air as she split firewood. The stacks against her cabin wall were not mere piles, they were fortress walls, meticulously arranged, seasoned, and protected from the elements. Her small garden, now dormant under a layer of frost-kissed soil, had yielded a bounty that filled every jar on her shelves. Rows of green beans, pickled beets, and preserved peaches stood like soldiers in her pantry, a testament to a summer spent in solitary, focused labor. Her husband, a geologist with a dreamer's heart, had taught her to read the land, but it was his absence that taught her to fear it. He had ventured into the high canyons 5 years prior, chasing a rumor of silver, and had been caught in a freak summer storm that turned a dry creek bed into a raging torrent. He was gone in an instant, trapped by a force he never saw coming. Adeline, who had been waiting for him back at their camp, found only his battered hat downstream. She was 21, and the world had shown her its teeth. After she sold their claim and bought this small plot of land, chosen specifically for its 2 key features, the defensible cabin and the limestone cave across the ravine. The townsfolk saw it as a retreat into grief. She knew it was a strategic position. Her dog, Kaiser, was more than a companion, he was her sentinel. His ears, perpetually alert, were her early warning system. He patrolled the perimeter of their small clearing with a silent, wolf-like grace, his gaze scanning the tree line. He never barked without reason. He was a creature of purpose, much like her. Together, they formed a self-contained unit, a silent partnership built on mutual trust and the shared understanding that survival was not a passive state, but an active, daily pursuit. While the town gossiped, Adeline worked. While they laughed, she prepared. She remembered the shock on her husband's face, the helplessness in his eyes as the water rose. She had been unable to reach him, a chasm of rushing water between them. Never again, she had vowed. Never again would she be separated from safety by an obstacle she could not cross. The bridge was an ugly, beautiful thing, a testament to sheer, brute force engineering. Adeline had no formal training, only her late husband's books on geology and structures, and a will forged in the crucible of loss. She had spent the first year felling trees on her side of the ravine, using a block-and-tackle system with Kaiser as her anchor to drag the massive logs into place. she built the support trusses first, sinking them deep into the earth and rock on both sides, a foundation that the town could not see but which she knew could withstand a gale. Then came the decking, plank by thick plank, the raw, fragrant scent of pine filling the air. The most peculiar part, the part that truly cemented her reputation as the crazy widow, was the roof and walls. She was enclosing it completely. "It's a coffin on stilts," one of the younger farmhands had shouted from the valley floor one afternoon, his laughter echoing off the cliffs. Adeline hadn't even flinched, just continued to hammer another nail into place. Inside the long, dark tunnel, the world fell away. The roar of the creek in the ravine below was muffled to a distant whisper. It was a corridor between two worlds, the fragile, wooden world of her cabin and the ancient, stone security of the earth itself. She had even hauled flat stones from the creek bed to lay a stable floor inside the cave's entrance, creating a small, level patio just beyond the bridge's end. There, she had installed a small, cast-iron stove, its pipe cleverly vented up through a natural fissure in the limestone, a chimney designed by the mountain itself. The town saw a bizarre obsession. They saw wasted effort, a woman consumed by a meaningless project. But Adeline saw a lifeline. She saw a heated, sheltered, unblockable path to absolute safety. Every nail she drove was an act of defiance against the random cruelty of nature. Every plank she secured was a promise to the man she had lost, that she would not just endure, she would prevail. The bridge was not a monument to her grief, it was the weapon she had built to fight it. The bell above the door of Gable's general store jingled, and a hush fell over the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. Adeline stepped inside, Kaiser at her heel, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the wooden floorboards. She nodded silently to the room and walked to the counter, her worn leather satchel held in one hand. She needed salt, a large sack of it for preserving the last of her autumn harvest, and more kerosene for her lamps. Mr. Gable leaned forward, a practiced, patronizing smile on his face. "Building up the fortress, are we, Adeline?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Should we be expecting a siege?" A few of the men snickered. Adeline's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. "Just the salt and the kerosene, please, Mr. Gable." Her voice was low and calm, betraying no reaction to the jibe. As he weighed the salt, Finn the blacksmith, who was nursing a cup of coffee by the stove, spoke up, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Heard a story the other day. Said you were hauling rocks into that cave now. Planning on furnishing it for guests." The laughter was louder this time. Adeline placed her coins on the counter, her movements deliberate. She ignored Finn completely, her focus entirely on the transaction. It was a performance of composure she had perfected over the past 2 years. Their words were like stones thrown into a deep well, they made a noise and then disappeared, leaving the surface calm. But the silence that followed her was its own kind of condemnation. As she walked out, the bell jingling her departure, the whispers began anew. "It's a shame," one man's wife murmured to another. "Such a pretty thing, to have her mind go like that." They spoke of her as a tragedy, a cautionary tale. The story of Adeline, the widow who lost her husband and then her senses, was woven into the fabric of Harmony Gulch. Her isolation was a self-imposed exile in their eyes, proof of her instability. They couldn't imagine that she found more comfort in the silent company of her dog and the honest labor of her hands than she ever could in their pitying glances and cruel jokes. She didn't need their approval. She was preparing for a test they didn't even know was coming. The first sign was the silence. One morning, Adeline awoke to an unnerving stillness. The usual chatter of squirrels and chirping of birds was gone. The forest was holding its breath. She stepped onto her porch, a mug of steaming coffee in her hands, and saw Kaiser standing at the edge of the clearing, his body rigid, his nose pointed north. A low, almost inaudible whine rumbled in his chest. His gaze was fixed on the distant peaks, which were shrouded in a strange, yellowish-grey haze that she had never seen before. The air was cold, but it was a dead cold, without the crisp, cleansing feel of a normal autumn morning. It felt heavy, oppressive. Adeline trusted the dog's instincts more than any weather forecast a man could offer. Kaiser's unease was a barometer for the unnatural. She set her mug down and went back inside, her movements now imbued with a new urgency. She spent the day in a final flurry of preparation. She checked the seals on her cabin's windows, stuffing any small gaps with strips of wool. She hauled the last of her split firewood onto the porch, stacking it high against the wall. She filled every bucket and basin she owned with fresh water from her well. Inside the covered bridge, she hung 3 kerosene lanterns on the hook she'd installed, filling each one to the brim. She carried sacks of grain, dried meat, and a large bag of Kaiser's dried fish into the cave, along with a thick pile of woolen blankets. She wasn't panicking, she was completing a checklist that had lived in her mind for years. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to the color of a deep bruise. The sun vanished not behind the mountains, but behind a solid, advancing wall of cloud that seemed to swallow the light. The temperature began to drop, not gradually, but in sickening lurches. A gust of wind, sharp and brutal, tore through the valley, rattling the cabin windows. Kaiser, now inside, refused to leave the hearth, his eyes tracking Adeline's every move. He knew. And looking out at the malevolent sky, Adeline knew too. This wasn't a storm. This was a reckoning. The blizzard did not arrive, it detonated. One moment, the world was grey and tense, the next, it was a maelstrom of white fury. The snow didn't fall, it flew horizontally, driven by a wind that screamed like a dying animal. It was a physical assault, a relentless battery of ice and air that stripped leaves from the trees and scoured the very face of the landscape. Adeline stood by her window for only a moment, watching the world she knew disappear. The trees across the clearing became faint ghosts, then vanished entirely. The sheer violence of it was hypnotic. She felt the cabin shudder under the impact of the wind. A deep, groaning sound came from the timbers of the roof as the snow began to accumulate with impossible speed. Within the first hour, the drifts were halfway up her door. This was what she had prepared for. "Come on, boy," she said softly to Kaiser. The dog was already on his feet, waiting. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a thick scarf around her face, and lit one of the lanterns. The light cast a warm, steady glow, a small bubble of order in the roaring chaos. Opening the door that led directly into the covered bridge was like opening an airlock. The wind howled at the threshold, trying to force its way in, but the tunnel held. She stepped inside, Kaiser pressing close against her leg, and pulled the heavy door shut behind her. The sound of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a deep, resonant drumming on the roof above them. They were in the belly of her creation, a wooden artery connecting life to stone. The lantern light swayed, sending their shadows dancing along the rough-hewn walls. Below their feet, she could feel the faint vibration of the bridge, flexing in the wind but holding firm. They walked the 100 yards over the invisible chasm, a journey that felt both impossibly long and perfectly safe. At the other end, she pushed open the door to the cave. A wave of still, cool air, smelling of earth and stone, greeted them. She stepped inside, into the quiet, absolute dark of the mountain's heart. For 3 days, the world was erased. The blizzard raged without pause, a monolithic, deafening force of nature. In Harmony Gulch, life ground to a terrifying halt. The snow piled up in monstrous drifts, burying porches, sealing doors, and collapsing the roofs of weaker structures. The town was entombed in ice. Inside their homes, families huddled together, their laughter and mockery long forgotten, replaced by a gnawing fear. The temperature plummeted to depths no one had ever experienced. Woodpiles that were meant to last a month were devoured in days. Food was rationed. The cold was a living entity, seeping through every crack, turning breath to frost and chilling bones. Finn the blacksmith, a man who had lived his life by the heat of the forge, sat in his freezing home, his powerful hands numb and useless. He had burned through his personal wood supply and was now starting on his furniture, the finely crafted chairs breaking apart with a sad crackle in the hearth. Mr. Gable, in his store surrounded by provisions he couldn't keep from freezing, watched the temperature in his storeroom drop past the point of no return. Barrels of apples turned to solid ice, and sacks of potatoes became rocks. The Dawson family, with their 6-year-old daughter running a fever, were in the most dire situation. Their cabin was small, poorly insulated, and their firewood was gone. The child's cough grew worse, a weak, rattling sound in the crushing silence between gusts of wind. The town that had felt so robust, so permanent, was breaking apart, its social bonds freezing along with its water pipes. There was no help to be had. Every man was for himself, every family an isolated island of shivering desperation. The communal confidence that had fueled their jokes about the lonely widow had shattered, leaving only the cold, hard truth: they were not prepared. They had mistaken comfort for security, and routine for readiness. And now, buried under 10 feet of snow, they were paying the price for their lack of imagination. On the fourth day, the wind finally lessened its assault, its shriek diminishing to a low, mournful moan. A fragile, blue-white light filtered through the snow-caked windows of the town, revealing a landscape of alien beauty and utter desolation. It was Dr. Munro who made the first move. He had spent the last 3 days tending to the sick, his own supplies dwindling, his heart heavy with the certainty that people would start dying if something didn't change. The Dawson girl was his greatest worry, her fever was high, and the cold was stealing what little strength she had left. His mind raced through the possibilities, dismissing each one. No one could get out of the valley. No one could get in. Then, an image surfaced in his mind: Adeline's cabin, isolated on its ridge, with that strange, ridiculous bridge leading to the caves. He had dismissed her as eccentric, a woman lost in her own world, but he had also seen the methodical way she worked, the sheer tonnage of firewood she had stacked. While they had been complacent, she had been busy. It was a desperate, foolish hope, but it was the only one he had. Bundling himself in every layer of clothing he owned, he ventured out into the blinding white. The snow was chest-deep, a thick, heavy powder that made every step a monumental effort. He fought his way to the blacksmith's shop, where he found a grim-faced Finn. "I'm going to the widow's place," the doctor gasped, his lungs burning. Finn looked at him as if he were mad. "You'll die before you get halfway. The Dawson girl will die if I don't," Munro countered. "That woman, she prepares. If anyone has a surplus of wood, it's her." A flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or a desperate ember of hope, crossed Finn's face. He nodded slowly, grabbing his own heavy coat. The two men, a doctor and a blacksmith, two of Adeline's many mockers, began the grueling trek out of town, fighting their way through the frozen landscape toward the one person they had unanimously written off as a fool. It took them 3 hours to cover a distance that would normally take 30 minutes. When they finally crested the last rise, they stopped, breathless, staring at a sight that made no sense. Adeline's cabin was dark, nearly buried, a silent mound in the snow. But across the ravine, from the mouth of the cave at the end of her impossible bridge, a thin, steady plume of smoke rose into the still, frozen air. Adeline was tending to the small stove when she heard it. A faint shouting, muffled by the snow and the stone. Kaiser heard it first, his head lifting, a low growl starting in his throat. She quieted him with a hand on his back and walked to the entrance of the bridge. Peering through a small gap she'd left in the door, she saw them, 2 figures, snow-caked and exhausted, stumbling at the edge of her property. It was Dr. Munro and Finn. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, weary certainty. She unbarred the door and stepped out onto the bridge, her lantern held high. "Dr. Munro," she called out, her voice clear in the frozen air. The men looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and profound relief. "Adeline," the doctor called back, his voice hoarse. "Thank God. We need help. It's the Dawsons' little girl. She's sick. We're out of firewood." "Everyone is." Adeline stared at them for a long moment, the lantern light illuminating the shame on their faces. There was no triumph in her, only a deep, aching sadness for what they had become. "Bring them here," she said, her voice devoid of accusation. "Use the bridge. It's the only way across." She guided them through the covered walkway, into the warmth and stability of the cave. They looked around in stunned silence. The space was transformed. It was a sanctuary of warmth and light. Blankets were laid out on raised wooden platforms. Sacks of supplies were neatly stacked against one wall. The small stove radiated a powerful, life-giving heat. It was a pocket of civilization carved into the heart of the mountain. As she gave them hot broth, Dr. Monroe finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a question that went beyond their immediate predicament. "Adeline, this place. This bridge. Why?" Adeline looked away from him, toward the gentle orange glow of the stove. She was silent for a long time before she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband," she began, "he was a prospector. He was caught in a flash flood in a box canyon. The water rose so fast. I was on the other side of the creek, on higher ground. I watched him try to climb, but the rock was too slick. He was only 20 feet away from me. 20 feet. But the water between us might as well have been an ocean." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "I couldn't reach him. He was trapped. I vowed that I would never be trapped again. I would never let a ravine, or a river, or a storm decide whether I could get to safety." The bridge wasn't about the blizzard. It was about that 20 feet of water. It was an answer to a prayer that had come 5 years too late for her husband, but just in time for them. The rescue of Harmony Gulch happened in slow, arduous stages. Finn, his strength renewed by the warmth and food, went back with a sled Adeline had built, returning with the Dawson family. The little girl, wrapped in warm blankets and placed by the stove, her breathing eased almost immediately in the gentle heat. One by one, or in small, shivering groups, Finn and Dr. Monroe brought the most desperate townspeople across the bridge. They moved through the wooden tunnel, a passage from a world of ice and death to one of warmth and life. Mr. Gable was among the last to arrive, his face pale and humbled, his usual bluster completely gone. He entered the cave and simply stared, taking in the scene of his neighbors, the very people who had laughed with him at Adeline's expense, now being saved by her foresight. He looked at Adeline, who was calmly spooning soup into a bowl for a child, her face serene. He opened his mouth to say something, an apology, a thank you, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. The cave, once the object of their ridicule, became their ark. The community that had ostracized her was now reformed within the shelter she had built, their old social order dissolved and replaced by a simple, shared gratitude. They saw her now not as the crazy widow, but as their quiet, unassuming savior. They saw the stacks of firewood, the preserved food, the neatly organized supplies, and understood that it wasn't madness they had been witnessing for 2 years. It was love. It was a fierce, protective love born from unimaginable loss, a love she had channeled into wood and stone, a love that was now big enough to save them all. The bridge, which they had called Adeline's Folly, now had a new name, spoken only in hushed, reverent tones, the lifeline. It stood as a silent, powerful monument, not to what she had lost, but to the enduring strength she had found. And in the warm, firelit quiet of the cave, surrounded by the steady breathing of the people she had rescued, Adeline finally felt the deep, unyielding ache of her grief begin to soften, replaced by the gentle warmth of a purpose fulfilled.